All right, welcome back. We are going to continue our discussion on using CSS in Shiny for making visual changes. And today we are going to discuss part of this last section, which is 6.5 CSS in action. And we have several sections here that we are going to cover. And in our studio, we'll see how changing some of the properties changes the visual elements of the Shiny app. So the first section in the chapter is about fonts, and it's particularly for the text styling within Shiny. So for fonts, we have the option to specify a font family for any tag. For example, for a paragraph tag or a div tag, we can specify a font family. And at the end, there's generally a serif or sans serif font that is specified. This is when the font that we are specifying here is not really used because maybe that font is not available in the region or on the user's device. There could be several reasons why it's not downloaded, and they then default to the serif font. In the CSS inspector tools within the browser, you can also look at what fonts are available. So let's switch to our studio in Posit Cloud. And this first script is about using fonts. And here I have, from our previous discussion, I have put in a font file, which is, let's see, should we write here the Parkinson's font file? Yeah. So within the www folder, that's right here. Let me move it like this. And we go to www folder. And here we have the Parkinson's, two font files for Parkinson's. And that's what I specified here. So we have a paragraph where I first specify Parkinson's here and sans serif at the end. So this is a font that is not already available on the devices of the users other than me. And if I deploy this app and I want this font to work, it would work if I download the font for them. So I have this part of the code that can download the font, but for now I am not using it. It's commented out. And I still specify Parkinson's and sans serif. Let's run the app and see what happens. So right now we see that there is a change in the color, and that's because for the paragraph we use color red property. But is this the Parkinson's font? Let's find out by looking into this within the browser. So here is the hello world paragraph. And I'm going to do inspect. And within the inspector tools, we are going to look at the element style. We do see the same style here. And if I do Shift Control P, and then I look for a CSS overview, and I need to click on Capture Overview here, then it shows me the overview summary as well as colors and font information. If I click on the font information, and let me increase the window size here, we see that sans serif is provided here. Helvetica is the default font, I believe, that is used. And Parkinson's is also available here. Now, Parkinson's is available because I have other previous script file that I used in our previous example, but it won't be available on a user device who is using this app because they don't have this font. Switching back, if I now stop this app and then include this CSS property of add font face and provide font family, this is the name that I can give this font. And then within SRC, within URL, I provide the path to the font. In this case, the font is in the exact same location where I have my CSS file, the style.css file. And it's also it's is actually in www folder, which Shiny understands. So I don't have to say www/. I can just say this. And now if I run this after saving my script, you do see that the font has changed here, and now it's using the font that's downloaded using font-face, and I give it a name here, the same name I use for font family, and it works. Okay. In with BSLib now, there are other options where we can use the theme options within BSLib, and with that we can actually provide font, which we'll eventually see in one of the next chapters. The second part of the text styling is about size of the font. So we may want to use different sizes. This is the same discussion about font paths if you want to provide a custom font. And in here, you can actually provide multiple paths as shown in this code chunk. So switching to size, there are two ways that we can provide size information. For example, relative size, which could be words like small, smaller, medium, bigger, and things like that. And we can also provide EM, for example, 1 EM, 1.8 EM to increase or decrease like 0.5 EM. So these are ways to provide font relatively. So it is relative to the default size, which is EM. EM is the size reference for the font. So the default size is 1 EM. And by the way, we will see that eventually for other things, but other than fonts, we can also change sizes of other things on our Shiny app. And we can also reference their EM to say that this should be in reference to the font size. Similarly, we can also provide actual sizes using absolute values like 16 pixels, 20 pixels. Here is an example for the size. Let's go back here. And for the size, I use this property again to name it, which is BEM that we discussed shortly, briefly in our previous discussion. So we have the name for the font and on what tag we are applying it to. So I believe this is the BEM way to name things. So within our class, we provide this name smaller dash dash h1, provide a font size of 0.75 EM, and smaller dash dash p, provide a font size of 80%. And in this case, we have 4 things in our app. 2 h1 tags will be generated and 2 paragraphs will be generated. And for h1s, we see there's a default h1 and then there's a smaller size h1, then a normal paragraph and a smaller size paragraph. So in this case, we specify class to change the sizes. Let's see what that looks like. So again, we have those 4 things and we do see different sizes for h1 and for paragraph because we specified the font size property. Next, is alignment. Alignment is where we want to move the text in different locations. So center, left, right, wherever we want in our Shiny app. So here, we don't have an example in the chapter, but I tried it here with right H1 and center P using the exact same app as before. But this time, instead of using font size, I just changed their alignment using text align property, right for the H1 and center for the paragraph. If we run that, we do see that the second H1 has become right aligned and the paragraph is now centered. There is, by the way, also bootstrap classes that we can use. I didn't use it here, but just for reference, there is a class called text-center. If we provide that, that will also make the alignment center for the text. And it applies not only to text, it also applies to other objects like a div container and so on. All right, but I found that in some cases, text-align works, but text-center does not work. So it's probably related to how Bootstrap defines the classes. Other styling options include font style and font weight. Let's see an example of that. So here again, I have a class italic-h1 and bold-p for h1 and paragraph tags. And let's run this app. And now we see that they are changed according to how we specified the font style and the font weight for the heading, h1, and paragraph objects respectively. Next is colors, and there are multiple ways to specify colors in Shiny. One is hexadecimal, which is, I believe, the most popular one that I've seen in Shiny examples, where we have hexadecimal code, which starts with a number or a pound sign, and then multiple numbers and letters. So this one, for example, corresponds to a white color, and so on. Then there's RGB code, which is red, green, blue, and it 255 indicates here the white color, and so on. So we can specify how to what brightness to give to red, to green, and to blue. And if we vary the value between 0 to 155 for each of them, it creates different colors. Another option is HSL, which stands for hue, saturation, and lightness. And yet another option is the color name, which is probably the easiest. So red, maroon, and so on. So there are many default options. But if you are using a custom color, you can then use hexadecimal or the other two choices. So these links are really useful in picking up the contrast colors that go on your Shiny app. So here's an example of using text color. I think I have that example here. Yeah. So here I am defining three classes: red for h1, blue for paragraph, and for the body. Body tag, we can use background color of orange. So in the discussion here, we have seen the text color, and the next section is about the background color. So background will change the background color of the object. In this case, it will change the background color of body, which is the whole HTML page that Shiny generates. And in this case, the background color is for the paragraph, which is a block element. And in this case, it is only the font color of h1. So let's see how that looks. So now, because I specified orange for the background color of body, the whole page is orange, and paragraph is blue, and h1 is red. Other two things, default h1 and normal p, they are using the default colors that are specified. All right, let's look at the next one, which is about creating borders and shadows. So each object on a Shiny app or in an HTML page is generally a block element. So there could be block elements or inline elements, but block elements take the whole width by default, and they are like a rectangle. And so we can specify their borders and shadows for those block elements. So we have these three to work with: the width of the border, color, and the type of the border. And there are multiple options as shown here. Another property is border radius, which will make the shape of the corners of the border rounded if we increase the value. The higher the value, the more rounded the border will be. Yet another property is to define the border properties in 4 ways. So instead of just saying border, we can also say border top, border bottom, and so on. That's to specify properties for each of them separately. And the properties for each of them will be, again, width, color, and type. And finally, for shadows, we have either the way to change the text shadow. Wherever we have text, we can assign a shadow to it, or a box shadow for blocks. Let's see examples of both of these. So here we are with the border example, where I created a class called my border. And in this case, I am using just a single paragraph, and I am giving it this class my border. Instead of defining the width, the color, and the type of the border once, just to show the variety that we have here, I provided it for all sections of the border, top, bottom, left, and right. And I also provided the border radius to show how that changes the corners of the border. So let's see what that looks like. So this is what we have. The top of the border is using is 4 pixels in size. That's why we see these thick values, and it's red, as we can see here, and it is dotted. For the bottom border, we have 2 pixels, so this size is relatively small. It's blue and it is dashed, as we can clearly see. And for the left border, I use the green color, and it is 6 pixel wide. That's why this is the thickest of all. And the type of the border is inset. I'm not sure how inset looks like because it's very small line and it's also thick, but there is definitely some difference from the other types. And then border right is, let me change the layout here a little bit. So here is the border right, which I defined as yellow, and the type of that is outset. You also notice that for each of these, not for each of these, but for the full border, the border is rounded. It's not rectangle, it's rounded at the corners, and that's because of the border radius property. If I change this to 0 pixels and then reload the app, now we see that it has become a rectangle. Similarly, if we reduce this to 1 pixel and then see, so on the left, we now see that the thickness has decreased significantly. This way we can specify the properties for the border, maybe not exactly this way, but it could be useful to highlight some of the things in our Shiny app. Next is shadows. As we said before, text and box shadow are some options, and they also have some syntax to provide this information. So we have the horizontal offset of the shadow, which means that from the default position of, if we talk about the text shadow, from the default position of the text, where does the shadow go? Does it offset horizontally or vertically? So we can specify properties for both. And we can also blur the radius of the shadow. So it will look nicer, at least in my opinion. Blurring it more looks more nicer. So let's see the example of that. So here I have example of both the block shadow and the text shadow. Before looking into the properties, let's see how we are applying that. So we have a div, which is essentially a container, and we have a paragraph tag here. And we, in both cases, I am providing classes. So for the block shadow, here are the properties. The first property is offset, horizontal offset, which is in this case 5 pixel. The second is the vertical offset. Then the third one is blur radius. And the fourth one is the color of the shadow. Similarly, for the text shadow, I have offset X, offset Y, blur radius, and the color of the shadow. Let's see what this looks like. So here, because the top one is a div, it is a container, we are taking the full block element and then we are applying shadow to that block element. So essentially that rectangle. And that's why it looks like this. In this case, notice that the vertical offset is only 2 pixels, but the horizontal offset is higher. It is 5 pixels. That's why we see that this thickness of the shadow is higher compared to the vertical thickness. For the text shadow, we have red color, which we use here, and it's not the very bright red here because we are blurring it. So the blur radius here is 5 pixels, and we have 1 pixel for the horizontal offset. So it has moved from the default position by 1 pixel to the right, and the vertical is 2 pixels, which is how it's moving below the default position of the text. So with this, it looks like this. If I change, for example, the blur radius to a smaller value like 1, and then reload the app, now we see that the red color is more redder. The hue is definitely clearly seen to be red rather than pink. And we can also clearly see the vertical offset. If I change this to 0 pixels, now we see it's horizontally moved to the right, but it's exactly at the same vertical position as the text.
Do you think it takes negative numbers?
Sorry?
Do you think it could take negative numbers?
Negative numbers, we can try. That's a good idea. Let's try for the vertical, let's try -5. Yep, it works.
Yeah, it can.
So it could be useful. I don't know where, but at least for some highlights, maybe it could be very useful. All right. Let's see what's next. So for the box, we also have the option to specify the border radius, which we have discussed before. And we can also specify the border as we have seen in the example, left, right, top, and bottom, and then also specify the box shadow for a given container. And in this case, this example is from the Shiny dashboard. Shiny dashboard has a box element, and they have their own class for box. And these are the properties of that class. So let's see that example here. I'm going to stop this one. And here we are loading the OSUI code library because it contains the Shiny dashboard box 2 code. So box 2 is used within Shiny dashboard, and it has those properties. So let's first run this, and we're gonna see this in the browser tab. Let's right click and inspect it. And for the element style, here is the box. So this thing is the main box that we have. And for this box, we have these properties. The position is relative, border radius is 3 pixels, background is white, border top, margin bottom, width, and box shadow. All of these properties are applied to this thing that is called as box in a Shiny dashboard. And in the chapter, they discuss and tell us that there is this tool that we can use directly because we want to make changes with trial and error to see what kind of offset we want to create. So if I switch back to the app, to the page, you see that with box shadow, we have this button here and then another button here. This one can change the properties of the shadow. So if I click on that, it opens up this window. And here I have the option to change the X offset and the Y offset. If I change the Y offset, increase it, it's probably not very clear, but maybe you notice right below right here, if you look, we see the changes. And by the way, we can do this vertically, but we can also do something like this. So it will make those changes appear as well. Because the color is gray, it's not very clear on the page, but we do see some changes. Similarly, we can increase the blur of the shadow, and we can also change the spread of the shadow. So we see some changes here. And now we can also make change to the color of the shadow. So let's say if I select the red color here, let's select this one and increase the opacity of that. Now we can clearly see what the border looks like. So this way we can make changes. And I think now it will be easier to see the changes right here. Right, so this makes it look like 3D or something.
Yeah, it's amazing how much detail we have about the CSS
Yeah,
code.
yeah. Yeah, this chapter is amazing.
And I know now how Emil can create so amazing presentations like CSS
Yeah,
is crazy to create presentations.
yeah, yeah, definitely. Though those are also his blog posts are really great. So here is the example from the chapter where they make changes to the default box, which we just did. But this is particularly what they mentioned in the chapter. So if we run this one, we'll see similar to what is shown in the chapter. So they've used this orange color, which is specified right here with the box shadow RGB and also the properties of the offset X, offset Y, and so on. Next is a very interesting section, which is about animations. This is very powerful framework. And if you go to this link in the chapter, this is a W3C page that introduces keyframes, which is the way to specify animations using CSS. And it has a lot of discussion and examples. In this chapter, we have just a few examples. The main way we can create animations of block elements, of text, and so on is to use this thing called as keyframes. So we use add keyframes. Similarly, as we specified downloading the font, add font face. So with add keyframes, we first specify the name of the animation. This is the name that we can provide. And then we tell it from what property of the block or whatever element we are targeting to what property do we want to change. So we can provide the property and the value of that property as the beginning thing and the new value at the end. If you want to do this more gradually so that it is more smooth looking, we can also use percentages. So 0% is when the app has just launched and we just got that element, then 25% and then 100% is at the end of the animation. So we can provide any property and value like different colors that the element will take depending on what we specify. So here's an example with keyframes animation. Let's go back to our studio and see how that works. So here I have two examples in the first attempt. Let's first run this one and I'm going to comment out this. Before I run this, let's look at the code. So within the style tag, where we provide the internal way to provide CSS, I say add keyframes and then my animation. This is the name that we can provide. And then I say from color auto, which is the default color, to color red. And I also have an additional CSS property here for H1 tag, which is the color gray. So the default color of H1 will be gray now. And I want to apply this animation to H1. In this case, if you do not apply the my animation to H1, obviously there will be no change and no animation will be run. That's why this is the first attempt. We do not see any animation, nothing happened to hello world. So we stop that and then switch to the second option, which again has the same CSS properties, but this time within the CSS property, for H1, we say that we are going to animate it and we use the animation property. the first thing we do is we provide the name of the animation, which we defined here. Then how long will we run this animation? So in this case, we specify 3 seconds. Then we specify if we want to delay starting this animation, which means that if you have a complicated Shiny app, running it will take some time to load the app. And if you have like just 1 second to run the animation, it will quickly run while the app is loading, while the other elements are loading. So it may not be a good idea to run the animation right at the beginning. So we wait for 2 seconds. So after the app has launched, 2 seconds are gone, then the animation will start so that your user has enough time to see the animation. And then the last property here is the animation loop feedback, something like that. I'm forgetting the name. Let's see. Sorry, it is animation fill mode. So animation fill mode specifies what happens if your animation has ended. What do you want to do at that point? Do you want to continue the last state of the animation? In this case, the last state is that the color should be red. So the color of H1, should it stay red or should it just go back to whatever the original color was, and so on. So forward says stay and keep the current state, which is the last state. So in this case, red color would stay. So if I run this, we see that after 2 seconds, the color gray turns to red and then it stays at red. If I remove forwards, it should then not keep it to red, but let's see. I didn't actually try this before. So after 2 seconds, it turns to red and then it goes back to gray. So with forwards, it will keep the last state. And there are multiple options. There's forwards, there are many other options. If you go to this link, which was specified above, this one, this takes you to multiple options and tells you if I open it here, it provides you with multiple options for specifying forwards and so on. So it's reverse, alternate, alternate reverse, and so on. Okay. Then there's also the option to, so in this case, there's this example of using blink for creating a blinking animation for a button. So let's see how that looks like. So here, before looking into the code, let's first look at the app. So in this case, this may be useful if you are adding a new feature to your Shiny app. Your user is familiar with current functions, but you add something new, and then you tell them, okay, this is new, click on this click button to get the calculation. So in this case, we have number 1 and number 2, and what we want is just to generate a sum of these two. So let's see how the animation is defined. So with add keyframes, we first provide a name to the animation. In this case, we call it blink. Then we don't specify what happened at 0% because if whatever is at the beginning, it will stay at the beginning. It will be the current property. But we specify 20%. So at 20% of the total duration of animation, let's say if it is 5 seconds, then 20% of 5. At that time, we have background color red, box shadow of these properties with we have the horizontal offset, vertical offset, and blur radius, and the color of the box shadow. And then we have the color of the font. Then at 50%, we change the background color from red to this color, which is a green color. I can quickly show that to you here. If I stop the animation, and So this is the screen color that we saw on the click button. And then we create a class called blink green. And within the class, we can either provide all the properties by specifying animation and then putting in all the values. Personally, I find it easier to provide each of these properties one by one so that I know what I am providing here. So the first thing is animation name. So I use this animation that I defined above. Animation duration will be 1 second. Animation delay is going to be 1 second. Animation iteration count is going to be 3, which means that this animation will run 3 times and then it will stop. And then animation timing function is linear. If we again see the same W3C school's website, we have multiple options. So in this case, I specify linear, but there are other options for animation timing, which means that how the animation starts to end. Does it go linearly? Does it go faster, slower? So we can control that. And then the rest of it is the normal Shiny calculations. And let me run this once more. We see that the color changes from red to green, and it happens 3 times and then stops. Next is layout, and today we are going to end to part of the layout. So layout is discussing the block and the inline tags. And we see that there are 3 block elements that are created here with some inline elements which are inside each of these blocks. So how do we lay them out? What properties can we use to either put them like a column as we see here, or like in one row or multiple rows? This section discusses those properties. So to style the blocks, we have previously seen CSS properties like margins and padding, which are defined here in this image. So for a given block element, if we look at one block element and its position relative to another block element, that can be controlled using margins. Margins define the space between 2 block elements. Within a block element, the content is inside, and the distance between the content and the border of the block element is called as padding. So these are like internal margins. So we can also specify a padding, margins. We can also specify width and height of the block. We can also specify the minimum height and minimum width of the block. But minimum width and height can only be specified in absolute units, but height and width can be specified relatively or in absolute units. And then there's also this property called as overflow, where we can handle what happens to things which are more in size than the block itself. So like we have a div container, but we have more things inside that div container than the size of that div container. So what happens? Do we want to show that? Do we want to put a scroll bar to still be able to see everything? Or do we not care about the boundaries of the div container and then still show everything, but that would still show the border of the div container, which may not look very professional, but depending on how we are showing our content may be appropriate. So here's this example that discusses all of these things. So we first create a class called as block to represent a block element. And in this case, we specify border color, border style, um, the background color of the block, which is light blue in this case, the text alignment, which we want to be center. All the text inside that block should be in center. The margin from other block elements should be 10 pixels. And margin can also be specified as margin top, margin bottom, margin left, and right. But in this case, we specify 10 pixels. That means for all 4 margins, it will apply a space of 10 pixels. Then there is minimum height and the width of the block element. Minimum height will specify what should be the absolute minimum height of the block element, regardless of what device you are on, whether you are an iPad or a large desktop computer or monitor. The minimum height will always be 200 pixels, but it could be larger if you're on a bigger screen. It could be at least 200 pixels, depending on the screen size. And the width is also absolute in this case, which is 200 pixels. Another thing that we have here are two tags, span and A. And for these two tags, we have a CSS property of background color orange. For now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to comment out this thing so that we'll see what happens if we have content which is uh, bigger than the element itself. So I'm going to save it. And just to show you the content of the app are these three div containers. With each of them has the class block. In this case, I'm using block 2, which we will discuss in a moment. And let me first change this to block so that we use consistently the same class. And for each of these, we have span elements. So span here we are using the anchor tag with lapply. So we have 2 anchor tags. And in this case, we have 5 span elements. And then I'm going to run this. And we get this. So this is actually the same example that is shown here with slight modifications. And this is the same thing as we see here. In this case, we see that these 3 block elements are in a column and they are in the center of the page. But in this case, they are, yes, in a column layout, but they're not in the center of the page. So let's open that here and then experiment with making it in the center of the page. So according to the chapter, if we change the margin to auto, that would essentially change the alignment of the block and it will make it to the center. So if I switch to this one, and for margins, instead of specifying 10 pixels, I say auto. Before I do that, notice that margin 10 pixels is going to apply the 10 pixel space between each block element. So 10 pixels is applied here and 10 pixels is applied here because all 3 are using the block class. If I change this to auto, all 3 are now using margin auto, and that puts all 3 of them in the center of the page, but we don't see any space between them. All right, let's switch back here. Okay, so that was one thing that we noticed. With margin, we can put everything in the center. And the second thing I wanted to show is the overflow property with block 2. So now I'm going to comment it in. And the difference from the previous one was is that I am now using height. I'm not specifying minimum height, just the height of the block. And this is smaller than the minimum height specified for the block class, which in this case is 200 pixels. So in this case, I am saying just 100 pixels. So the second thing that I'm doing here is overflow property. Overflow controls what happens if you have things which are overflowing from the block, which are bigger or longer than the block itself. So this third block is going to use the class block 2, and we have a lot of text here. So if I run this, now we have a scroll bar here. And that is because I say overflow Y scroll. But there are other properties that we can use for overflow. That is visible, hidden, scroll, and auto. So if I change that to visible and then reload the app. Now instead of the scroll bar, everything is outside the block element. It is visible, but we can clearly see that because this block element is just 100 pixels, it does not cover it properly. All right, so this is everything for today. For the next week, we are going to discuss Flexbox and the responsive design for media using media queries.
Perfect, thanks. So we can stop.